Thank you, and good morning. I'm going to be your initial speaker. And so obviously with that introduction, we can jump right into a further exploration of Oregon's innovative road usage charging program. So as we move forward here, I think two of the ways that Oregon was just described were trailblazer and pioneer. We love to lean into these descriptions. We have a basketball team named the Trailblazers. We still love that Oregon Trail style pioneering description. And so we really, as we approach this program of road usage charging and being the first state to have a fully functional program, we really take the approach to these types of efforts that new technology presents new challenges as well as opportunities. And so as we look back over history, in the early days, governments really struggled to regulate the transition from horse and buggies to more modern modes of transportation. As cars became more popular and more prevalent, those required better roads than the traditional horse and buggy did, as well as the emergence of bicycles too. They just needed better infrastructure. So the issue then came about of, how do we actually pay for these upgrades? And so even back then, it was really viewed as an opportunity to improve infrastructure through these different payment methods that we now know as a variety of road user fees. So in the 20th century, a gas tax certainly made sense because most cars, for the most part, were equally efficient. So they were effectively paying into the system at the same rate. But as we further get into the 21st century, that really isn't the case anymore. And fuel efficiency varies widely across makes and models. And the gas tax itself becomes a little less clear in terms of its ability to fund the system. Moreover, we're now exploring additional technologies such as connected vehicle ecosystems, automated vehicles, blockchain, things like that. And as we approach those technologies, they could really result in significant improvements to safety and mobility within the system, but we need to figure out a way to pay for them. They're certainly not free, and they're definitely not cheap either. And so we've arrived at an important crossroads that presents us an opportunity to develop a new funding mechanism that better suits the transportation trends of both the current modes of today, as well as the ones that we're planning for tomorrow. And so next up, at least for those of us on the West Coast being real early here, I'm sure the first thing you wanted to do today was start the day with a brief history lesson. So looking at kind of Oregon, and then also within the system of the federal landscape as well, Oregon was the first state to introduce a gas tax in this country, and that was in 1919. So it's been over 100 years since that was first implemented. That was promoted originally as a way to get Oregon out of the mud and really making those infrastructure improvements that the roads were usable for modes that were emerging at the time. And so it actually took about another decade before another state adopted a gas tax. Now you can see here on the slide that the federal government adopted its own gas tax in 1932. And the 30s were actually the time that Oregon conducted its first highway cost allocation study. And has done so biennially ever since. Maureen later in the presentation will dive further into what that cost allocation study looks like and what the implications are moving forward, given where we are in our revenue generation system today. Oregon continued that pioneering and trailblazing approach in the 1940s as well, being the first state to implement a weight mile tax program for its heavy vehicles. And then you see we kind of jump forward here quite a good amount of time to 2015, which is when Oregon's road usage charge program, known as OReGO, went live and became the first fully functional program in the country. And then in 2021, there's another slide with additional visuals related to this, but you're seeing additional states really begin to explore this concept of road usage charging within their legislatures. So moving on to something that's very much important to us within ODOT is the strategic action plan that was created by both the Oregon Transportation Commission and the Oregon Department of Transportation together. And what you see here are ODOT's 3 strategic priorities that truly inform our work, decision-making, and guide the process as we both act with them today and plan for the future. And so we see here we have a modern transportation system, sufficient and reliable funding, and equity. And when we talk about RUC, all three of those things really intersect in terms of how we try to incorporate that into our policy moving forward. And so beyond these initial three strategic priorities, those are meant to be accomplished via implementation of strategic outcomes. I'm not going to get into all those. There are 10 of them. The two that most closely relate to what we do with the road usage charge program would be implementing large-scale road usage charging, which is pretty self-explanatory in terms of that implementation, as well as achieving sufficient funding. So again, we're really looking at a new method for shoring up our transportation revenue generation to ensure that we can operate and maintain a modern multimodal system. So here's a simple graphic about road user fees. And when we talk about a road usage charge, that falls within this umbrella of road user fees. And really these fees encompass a variety of mechanisms, certainly some more common than others. Parking fees, transit fares, quite common, whereas downtown cordon fees, that's not really something we see much in this country. New York City has flirted with that idea for a number of years, but that's something you see more in international large cities. But again, it's when we talk about road user fees, it's really an umbrella term that covers any payment that people are making to use, are making in their use of the transportation system and facilities. And the way we're approaching this is that some of these options are certainly more viable as long-term sustainable solutions than others. And talking about that sustainability, if we have a real thesis, I think, in terms of this presentation today and how we go about as an office within ODOT, it's that fuel taxes are unsustainable. So we're really looking at other options within the road user fee umbrella, and that being really, at least for our focus currently, is that road usage charge. I think it's also probably fair to say that throwing $100 bills directly into potholes is unsustainable. I don't know if that policy has been explored at scale yet, so maybe I should reserve judgment, but we'll get into on the next few slides why fuel taxes in this day and age and moving forward are unsustainable from our perspective. So the first thing here is declining purchasing power. And so when we talk about the money being paid into the system via fuels tax, things like construction, operations, and maintenance services of the transportation system are increasing in cost, whereas gas taxes or revenues raised through those gas and fuel taxes really are not keeping pace. They're generally not indexed for inflation and therefore don't move in kind of the same, they don't move in concert with the increasing costs of the improvements being made to the system. Number two here is extremely important in the sense that the passenger vehicle fleet is becoming increasingly fuel efficient. I mentioned in the first slide that in the 20th century, most cars generally got the same mileage rating and had very similar efficiencies, whereas today there's quite a variation in terms of internal combustion engine vehicles of the mileage that they're getting. But generally speaking, all of those ICE vehicles over time are getting better and better mileage. And moreover, electric vehicles, which do not pay into a fuels tax, are expected to significantly increase their market share in the coming decade. And so what we're really looking at is an issue where vehicles that are paying into the system are paying less due to increasing efficiency. And we're also seeing the adoption of an entire fleet or type of vehicle that will not be paying into a system that we've been using, at least in Oregon, for over 100 years. And then the last one here is effectively that, with more people, there are more vehicle miles traveled. And so while in the case that if there was not increased fuel efficiency, that increase in vehicle miles traveled would result in additional fuel tax revenues, that's really not the case given those gains in efficiency. And so this is going to be different to different areas, whether it's at the state level or at the city level, but at least within Oregon, we're seeing very high in-migration to the state and to certain cities. And so this is the case that even if individual VMT is decreasing at an individual level of people potentially driving less, there's this cumulative effect of more people putting additional strain on the system and thus causing that wear and tear that we need to keep up in terms of that maintenance and operations effort. So this slide is meant to show, it's an example to show the impact of the increase in fuel efficiency within what we're taking in from a fuels tax. And so what you're seeing here is an example of 1,000 miles driven across 4 different types of vehicles. You see the electric vehicle again, which would not be paying into a fuels tax versus a hybrid, average efficiency, and then a low efficiency vehicle. And so really it's showing the difference in what those passenger vehicles pay in fuels taxes depending on that efficiency. And yet, generally speaking, all of these vehicles do roughly the same amount of damage to the roads. And that's due to the fact that, again, generally vehicles that are less than 10,000 pounds, so those that fall into the category of light duty vehicles, generally do the same amount of damage and wear and tear to these roads, but there's quite a discrepancy in terms of what they pay related to fuel taxes. This slide shows effectively what the cost would be for the same scenario within the road usage charge program. So again, we're looking at all of these vehicles driving 1,000 miles within a given month. And this is at a rate of 1.8 cents per mile, which had been OReGO's rate for, I believe, the previous 2 years. That has now gone up since the beginning of 2022, in which case it is now 1.9 cents per mile. But as you see here, this results in a more equal distribution of what these vehicles would be paying within the system, though overall costs to maintain and operate these vehicles would still vary, as you still have that difference within fuel efficiency of that average efficiency vehicle and that low efficiency vehicle would still be paying more in terms of actual gas costs, in that they would need to fill up more often than a hybrid, and obviously electric vehicle would not be filling up at all. And in this case, the truck is actually not eligible for the OReGO program in the sense that, as it currently works, vehicles that do not achieve at least a 20 miles per gallon or greater are excluded from the program. So this is effectively a diagram of how the system works for OReGO right now with our commercial account managers. We have 2 commercial account managers which provide services to the volunteers who participate in the OReGO program. And so if you follow the numbers here, generally speaking, those vehicles have a device plugged into their onboard diagnostics port, and that device is capturing and reporting the mileage to the account manager. So that account manager then aggregates the data and provides them with an invoice, which is then paid back to the account manager. That is transferred to the state, and the state provides oversight functions of the account managers to make sure they are in compliance and filing the required reports and tax filings and things like that. So again, this is a very kind of simplified overview of how the system works currently, but quite accurate in terms of the flow of how this all works on a monthly basis. And so when we went about designing this program, we really recognized that an open architecture is essential to the success of it moving forward. As a pioneering state within this field, we understood that if we got kind of stuck within a proprietary system, that would make it difficult to reach scale. And as we look at how the concept of road usage charging is really proliferating across a number of states, we wanted to make sure that we incorporated concepts of flexibility and adaptability within that open architecture to respond to technology changes over time, to make sure that other states could participate in this system as well as they further explored and implemented their own road usage charges. And in addition to that, an open architecture would help standardize the system. And beyond that, it's also easier to find integrators to support the system which gives owners more competitive options. So we really wanted to make sure that as we went about this, the architecture was open for a number of reasons. And so what you see here is a map of the states within 2016. The key here on the bottom, you'll notice that it mentions MBUF, MBUF. That stands for mileage-based user fee. That can effectively be thought of as the same as RUC. We're still kind of coming up with various terms across various states. We at Oregon certainly prefer the term RUC, road usage charge, but think of mileage-based user fees as the same thing. And so again, in 2016 here, OReGO launched on July 1st of 2015, or Oregon's RUC program. So you see that we are the only state in dark blue in that we had the only active program at the time, but a number of other Western states at least exploring the idea, if not already conducting pilots as well. And as we jump ahead in time here to 2021, you notice a stark contrast between the maps, as many states are now at least studying and exploring RUC to a greater extent. There's simply a lot more color here. And so the representation you're seeing on this screen is largely coming from the work of two consortia. One is RUC West, which really encompasses all those Western states in blue and green. And then you also have the Eastern Transportation Coalition, which is obviously your eastern seaboard of, again, exploring RUC and potentially piloting in a number of states. And then you see these state house icons as well, showing that these are states that within their legislature began exploring actual policy related to road usage charge. So again, between 2015 and 2016, 2016 and 2021, we see quite a bit of extra activity as states begin to lean into what we view as a very viable and sustainable method for raising transportation revenues moving forward. And so with that, I'll now turn it over to Maureen for the second half of the presentation.
Thanks, Scott. So a lot of people, when they think about our funding problems, they go, why don't you just tax trucks? And I think it's important to note in this, a lot of this is based on work being done by the Eastern Transportation Coalition. Trucks are already heavy users and payers of the road. So we need to recognize that. And I think it's important to note that there is some recognition that based on the weight of trucks, they should pay at least a different rate than passenger vehicles. So in Oregon, New Mexico, New York, and Kentucky, there is a weight mile tax that substitutes for the fuel tax. So when we think about it, we need to think about how do we allocate costs for these different vehicles. So the next slide talks about the highway cost allocation study. And in our constitution here in Oregon, we are required to do this every 2 years. So what it does is it determines the share that each class of vehicle should pay based on the entire stack of user fees that Scott alluded to earlier. And then the legislature can make adjustments to those fees depending on how out of sync the use of the roads are to those vehicles. So that's been really an important thing. What we notice, though, is as the revenue declines from fuel taxes for the light duty vehicles, we either had to make a change to the funding mix for light duty vehicles, or we would need to decrease what other vehicles paid. And that ends up being sort of like what I call the death spiral for our funding overall. So that's really not sustainable, especially when we have more people coming in to use our roads. So it's been really important to start standing up something different, like a road usage charge, to supplement the fuel tax rate from the light duty vehicles. At the same time, we want to maintain equity among the different vehicle classes. So we are getting ready to do a equity study comparing fuel tax to road usage charging to make sure that light duty vehicles or passenger vehicles are paying their fair share depending on whether they're ICE vehicles or EVs. And then we will replicate that work for medium duty vehicles because they are also becoming very efficient. Then we also want to apply a lens of So that's the cost allocation lens or cost responsibility lens. Then we also want to apply a tax equity lens to make sure that people in similar economic circumstances are paying roughly the same amount of taxes. And then the last one is a social equity lens. And we've done some work on rural and urban populations and have discovered that really rural populations tend to drive less efficient vehicles, although they do drive longer distances, but they're generally paying their fair share. So if they were moved to a RUC system, they might actually pay less for their use of the roads than they do now. And urban populations tend to drive more efficient vehicles, but take more trips. And so in our state, at least, the number of miles driven are about the same. So we have made a conscious decision at this point to leave inefficient vehicles on a fuel tax. So the one thing that we have noted, though, in our running of the program is that electric vehicle owners really want to pay their fair share too. Plug-in America has done a number of reports in which they've noted that they will support the eventual adoption or development of a road usage charge. And in OReGO, about 50% of our new participants drive hybrid or electric vehicles. And as they develop experience with the program, they're more likely to actually continue to participate and actually be advocates for the program. So we're leveraging that familiarity effect in the program. The other thing that we've been doing is researching the similarity between RUC and tolls. And so as this shows, there are a lot of substantial similarities. So we know that there are local option fuel tax programs throughout the state. We wanted to look at ways to see if we could replicate a local option road usage charge program in our state, even though it's not currently authorized by the legislature. We wanted to do a pilot to see if it was going to work. It ends up being very much like tolling. So if you look at the next, so what we had to do to make this work with the data collection for tolling or for a local option program, we had to geofence areas and make them different than the state. So when we set up the program, we actually created these different identifiers for geographic areas. So the rural ID is the highest level, and that is an identifier that identifies the geographic boundaries of all the states, Canadian provinces, and Mexican states. And then the next layer down is what we called a sub-rural ID, and that can be used for identifying some kind of political subdivision, like these are the counties in Oregon. But it could be for a city as well. And then on top of that, there can be a zone ID that is a further differentiated geofenced area. And that can be then priced and layered on top of those other areas. And we actually did this test in Oregon. We just finished this. So we used the zone ID for the state of Oregon and then applied the rural ID for the state, sub-rural ID for these other boundaries, and then on the middle one, you'll see the application of a zone ID as well. So what we did here is we applied these geofenced areas. Our account managers geofenced them. We tested those boundaries, and then we recruited volunteers to actually drive in those areas and share their experiences with us. So that travel times that were priced were based on some work that we did with our partners in the Portland metro area. So what you see is the base rate was still the state rate, and then different areas got to charge different rates. And the next slide actually shows how those play out in a tabular form. So you can see there the rural ID, sub-rural ID, and zone identifiers on those and the priorities that were given to them. And this is what we gave our account managers for them to be able to charge the appropriate rates. What we found from this is that generally people wanted more information after they had a chance to participate. But once they experienced, they really did understand it. And they were surprised at how affordable it really was. One of the things that we wanted to determine in doing this was whether or not people would actually change their behavior. Most people said they would not change their behavior because they don't have access to other modes, so they can't mode shift. But about a quarter of them said they would. So this reinforced our understanding that education really does help change opinions about people's perception of the program, about fairness, and it also tends to support that most people would be supportive of a tolling kind of situation if it helped with congestion, but they were concerned about equity. So we shared that information with our nascent tolling program. The next body of work that we're going to do is to look at point of sale enrollment. Currently, people have the option of paying a registration surcharge if they buy a vehicle that is rated at more than 40 mpg, or they can opt into OReGO. So because of COVID, we did not get to go out and actually educate people about this change in the law. So most people that enroll end up finding out about this themselves and then going to their dealership and educating their dealership about it. We don't think that's a very efficient way to do business, especially not if we're trying to move the program towards a mandatory a mandate in the future. So we are getting ready to do some dealer engagement. We will do that not only with dealerships here in Oregon, but also in Southwest Washington, because we understand that a lot of Oregonians do cross the river if they live in Portland to buy cars. So we want to make sure that we understand how dealerships engage on this. How do they want to get information? What is the easiest way for us to reduce the burden on them for getting people to be able to enroll in the program? So once
Maureen?
we do that with, pardon?
This is Rajat. We've got a bunch of questions about some tax related to tax. Would you like to take them?
Sure, be happy to.
Scott? Yeah, so let me, there's two questions about the OBD port data. So let me read that. Perhaps you can answer them pretty quickly. So the first one is from Jonathan Snyder. There is a dependency on OBD2. So only model year 1996 and newer vehicles are eligible. How are you planning to incorporate over the air or OTA in the future? And then the second question is probably related to that from Ben Town. Also, how do you handle the privacy concerns associated with OBD data? I guess that relates to your volunteers, right, who have OBD devices plugged into their vehicles.
So currently it's a voluntary program. So we were able to define what were eligible vehicles. We decided, and our law requires us to also provide options for non-vehicle location technology. So we have two kinds of devices. We have one that's GPS enabled, one that is not. Privacy is taken care of in our statute through a couple of mechanisms. One is that the data goes to the third-party account manager. They price the trip. They give people the credit for fuel tax paid on taxable miles driven. So there's an offset there. They can only keep that data for 30 days after account settlement, and then it has to be destroyed. So all the state gets is aggregated, anonymized data. We never actually see individual driving data at all. So third parties, non-GPS option. We recently have done a manual option. And the other thing is for law enforcement to get access to the data, they have to get a warrant and go to the account manager to get driving pattern data if it's still available. So if we had it, it would be potentially a public record request, absent, a specific statutory provision to exempt it. But by having it in the hands of a third-party account manager, it is not state data. So what we get from our account managers is a quarterly report where they pay us on all taxable miles driven. As for vehicles that are older than 1996, they're not eligible for the program, and most of them don't get more than are not rated at more than 20 mpg, so they wouldn't be eligible for the program anyway. At launch, we did have older vehicles older in terms of, 96 that were under 20 mpg, and they actually did get a refund of their fuel tax. That was changed by the legislature to do away with refunds, in part because they wanted to preserve our revenue stream. And, like other states, we had borrowed money and we had pledged fuel tax revenue to repay that money. Our bond counsel advised that we potentially could be impacting negatively our bond rating if we continue to have this refund program. So we took that option off the table after the legislation passed. What we're looking to do in the future, and we've done some work in this area, is trying to get information directly from vehicles so our account managers can actually use that data and not rely on an OBD2 port device. So one of the things we're doing now, and this is an active procurement right now, is we are looking at developing a connected vehicle ecosystem that leverages IoT, edge computing, and information directly from the vehicles and puts it in the cloud. And then with our open ecosystem allows for our account managers to actually get access to that data to provide services. We're looking at this not just for RUC, but we're also looking at to improve our ITS functionality. In part, we know that vehicles are becoming more connected, so we're trying to figure out ways to ensure that we can reduce injuries and deaths on our infrastructure and support a new revenue stream. So that's really why we're trying to do this connected vehicle ecosystem. And we also really are looking at developing something that we call a mobility marketplace that now allows the person to aggregate the things that make sense for them to aggregate and pay for it with a single wallet. So currently in our road usage charge program, a user can get access to vehicle diagnostic information from their card. One of our account managers offers remote emissions testing using the same device. We have 2 airships in the state where emissions testing is required. And so that's a nice thing to avoid having to go to a brick and mortar test site to have your emissions tested. That information is then relayed to our Department of Environmental Quality and our DMV, and then a person can re-register their vehicle. Now, we also are exploring toll payments. So when our toll program is operational in the state, we expect that a person will be able to use their RUC account to pay for tolls, as well as the road usage charge. So we think all of these things are possible. It's really like mobility as a service, but with a payment option. So one of the things that we are trying to do, and we've done an interoperability test with both Washington and California, we're looking at ways to make all of this more streamlined. And that gets to the question of how are we going to use blockchain? We are hoping to use blockchain to help with clearinghouse functionality. The things we need are miles driven, fuel used. We have to provide privacy protection. We need vehicle identification, or at least our account manager does. And we're trying to promote this idea of a mobility marketplace. And we really think that Mobi is developing standards that can help us get there. And I mean, we know that technology is a disruptor for us. We know that, transportation is very, very important to the traveling public. We know that education matters, political, public, private sector. Everybody needs to be educated about how things are working now and how we need to improve them and why. The public expects really seamless delivery. They get that from the private sector. They're expecting that from the public sector. So we're trying to leverage emerging technologies to make our transportation system efficient, effective, and affordable. And to that end, that we work with a lot of different groups trying to develop standards that enable road usage charging, because we think it'll be the funding stream of the future. So, I mean, I guess in conclusion, I'd say that we have a long history here in Oregon of responding to changing transportation needs based on whatever's going on. I mean, we passed the first bicycle tax in 1901, the first gas tax in 1919, and the world keeps changing, and we need to change with it. And the rate of change is increasing as well. So we need to be thinking about how to future-proof our revenue streams. And while fuel tax is, can't keep up with demand now, it's still a real workhorse, and we need to keep it in place, especially as long as there are inefficient vehicles on the road. We know that inflation is going to keep rising in some form or fashion. So we're really looking for a way to establish an affordable system going forward. And a return to the user pays principle means finding a way to, actually charge all road users. And we think road usage charging is one solution. That's it. Questions?
Very well. Thank you, Maureen and Scott. There's a whole bunch of questions. Let me go back to the third question from Jonathan Snyder about, he asks, can we revisit the costs associated with low mileage vehicles? I feel like with this model, it applies pressure and questions the value associated to vehicles utility. If percentages of all sold and registered vehicles are for true utility purposes, such as landscaping, plumber, etc., won't that surcharge be passed on the recipient of the job? No, I understand that not all trucks are used for business purposes. Long question.
Well, so those trucks, if we're talking about inefficient trucks, those that don't get a combined 20 miles per gallon, then they are continuing to pay the gas tax as they have for, however long those trucks have been in circulation. And so if there is any, downstream economic impacts of that, it's really no different, I think, than how things work currently. If businesses, in recent times have potentially raised their costs at all due to, increasing gas prices, increasing diesel prices, that's something I think that maybe already occurs. And at least as we talk about this program, if they are ineligible for it due to, their mileage rating, then not much changes for them. So they would simply continue on with the existing fuels tax system that has been in place for a number of years.
Thanks. Matt Milligan asks, how does the cost of administration / operation of the gas tax compare to the cost of a RUC program in Oregon?
It's really, really high. Let's put it like that. So our program currently actually loses money every year. And I'm okay with that, honestly, because we are running an experimental program in large measure. It's not at scale yet. We predict at scale it will make us money, but we have to start somewhere. So this is like R&D. My thing is we need to try something. We need to fail early and small, adapt, and move on. So that's what we've been doing since we launched the program. I used to run the fuel tax program here in Oregon, and we collected $40 million in revenue every month. And it cost on a biennial basis about $2 million to run that program. So it was very, very efficient. I will tell you, when the program started back in 1919, we imposed that tax on fuel distributors in part because gas pumps did not have metering devices on them. And so the most efficient way to charge for gas was charge the distributor, because they knew how much fuel they delivered to all these little individual gas stations. But those companies sent us typed forms that had to be notarized with a check. And then we, recorded them in a handwritten ledger. And I know it sounds like I was around for that, but I wasn't, trust me. But I had all of this information from the program when I ran it. So it was not that efficient when it started either. So, you know, I'm committed to building this program, making it as efficient and affordable as possible, but also trying to future-proof it. And
Yeah.
I've been really blessed to work with really smart people who have been asking really good questions and challenging us to do better and to think about different ways to do it. And that's one reason I'm really committed to working with Moby and other groups like that. It's because it helps us be a better program.
Yes, absolutely. And there's we have a comment. I don't think it's a question. It's pretty long. It's from Otto Fromeld. Wait to hear the RUC innovation initiatives. How are you managing it in the US? While the US is currently ahead on the car side, Europe is ahead on the truck side. The RUC on heavy truck is based on internationalization of external costs. This is an acceptable approach by truck hauliers and logistics companies in US. From European side, I'm curious to see a holistic charging system that is fair share of equity for miles traveled, including truck, buses, motorcycles, etc.
You faded
And
a little bit there. I didn't know if there was a question there or if that was
no,
just
I don't think it's a.
Okay.
I don't see a question there. Matt Milligan asks, in your customer feedback, did you find that people are more comfortable with the account manager having their location data instead of the government?
We haven't actually done a lot of work on that question. We do have one account manager that is like the state option. So they run a program on our behalf. They have a device that they provide that does not have GPS enabled in it. So it's a real, you know, no value added services. It's just recording and reporting mileage. And then the third party does the account management for us. Very few people opt for that. Most people opt for the GPS enabled device and a commercial account manager, in part because they get other value added services. So they can geofence where they want their children to drive and know where their kids are, if their kids are driving outside of that geofenced area. So people will tell us all of the value added services that they use related to that device that have nothing to do with participating in the RUC program. And I think you talk about gamification, helping people accept new things. One account manager does offer some gamification of driving behavior, and a lot of people really like that as well.
Mm-hmm. Otto from Mel also asks, how do you use blockchain technology? How is the interoperability managed with government legacy systems? What has been your experience so far?
So we did the interoperability pilot with California on behalf of RUC West, and we're going to use that set of requirements as they've been refined to test blockchain to see if that's a more useful way to do clearinghouse functions. And so that's really where we're starting to look at blockchain as being a potential solution. We also think, though, that in the future with VID, that's going to be a really good way to manage vehicle transfers and those kinds of things when we get to that point in the program.
Mm-hmm. He also asked, do you have a legal basis that is the dedicated blockchain law to operate in a trustful legal environment?
We do not at this point.
Okay. Josh Squire asks, for the mobility marketplace, doesn't it make more sense to develop a decentralized marketplace so the consumer gateway platform of choice can offer the mobility products?
I'm trying to figure out, I think we're looking at a mobility marketplace as not us necessarily providing it, but letting people aggregate from the marketplace what they want to have associated with their account. So I don't really have good transit where I live. So for me to aggregate, you know, a transit account with my RUC account would not make sense for me. So I wouldn't do that. But I'm looking at a way to, on behalf of the program, to let people go out into the marketplace, aggregate whatever services they want that makes sense for them, and have a single way to pay for that service. And that's what we're hearing from people. They don't want 10 different accounts to pay for, one for parking, one for transit, one for, you know, tolling, one for road usage charging, whatever. They want to have one way to pay for that. So that's really the idea behind a mobility marketplace.
Okay, thanks. So I'm going to ask one more question, and then I would like to open the floor for some comments from the audience, if they don't want to, you know, type in the chat. Just raise your hand if you want to make a comment, and then we'll open up your mic. So the last question from the chat box is, does ODOT have specific goals for growth of RUC program? Given your initiative with dealership engagement and education, it appears there are efforts underway to scale it up. Relatedly, is there a vision to have a functioning mobility marketplace by a certain time in the future?
We do have specific growth plans. Actually, last legislative session, which was in 2021, there was a bill promoted by our Road User Fee Task Force that would have made a mandatory program starting with model year 2027 vehicles that had a combined fuel efficiency rating of at least 30 mpg. That bill made it through committee and then did not get a floor vote. So we are going to be promoting that as an agency bill in the 2023 legislative session and pushing the date to model year 2029. That's kind of Scott's body of work. So if you want specific questions, you should probably address those to him. But we are, we've written a 5-year plan that basically does incremental steps that get us closer to that. Dealer engagement is one of those things, because we clearly need to have these new cars in the program by calendar year 2028 if it's effective for model year 2029 vehicles. We have a lot of work to do to be ready to support a mandate of that scale. At the same time, we've spent a lot of time socializing the concept of road usage charging with other states, sharing information with them. We've recently deployed a business partner portal on our website, so anyone that's interested in being a business partner can go out and find our program requirements documents. So if anyone is interested in that 5-year plan, I'm happy to share it and take feedback on it, candidly, because we're sitting here in Oregon pretty much just, you know, going, well, what makes sense? I have a whole whiteboard wall full of random thoughts like, what do we do about data ownership in a connected vehicle ecosystem?
Yeah.
You know, all those things.
Would anybody like to ask a question through a mic? If so, please raise your hand in the using the menu so that we can turn on your mic. If I don't see any hands raised, I'll go back to the chat box. Okay, Rahul, please go ahead.
Good morning,
Please keep your
everyone.
question short. Please keep your question
Yes.
short.
Yeah. What is the relationship between RUC West and ETC, and how are you collaborating on understanding the data that is being generated on both sides?
There
Thank you,
isn't
Rahul.
really a formal relationship between RUC West and ETC. Trish and I spent a lot of time on committees together. We're both on the NCHRP committee that's looking at the roadmap for adoption of a RUC program. So we share information informally, but we And we have, through the help of FHWA, had joint sessions at TRB meetings and those kinds of things. So we do stay in touch. They've been focused a lot on heavy vehicles. RUC West has been more focused on passenger vehicles, but we do share data back and forth and outcomes.
Thank you.
We have 3 more minutes left. Rich from
Raul
Accenture.
asked the question about whether or not we use Arnold data for road precision or upgrade our own linear reference system. You know that is way outside my expertise. I'm a tax person, not an ITS person or an engineering type person. So that would be a question that I would have to pass along to our ITS manager.
Appreciate it. It's just because you mentioned, so the use of blockchain to create geofenced IDs and allow for an understanding would also require precisions on the surface.
Mhm.
And I know that many states are updating that data set, so you could feed something like a mobility as a service in a platform. So that's why I asked the question, but I appreciate it. Thank you.
Rich, you want to ask a comment or a question? Sorry, ask a question.
Hi, everyone. Maureen and Scott, just really appreciate the presentation, the thought going into the RUC program and pioneering this. Maureen, as we have talked, I see a tremendous potential here to be able to leverage blockchain to be able to create some of the infrastructure that you're talking about here for not only the RUC, but also the marketplace that you mentioned as well. I completely agree with your comment that an individual consumer doesn't necessarily want to doesn't want to manage 5, 6, 7 different wallets for all of their transportation multimodal needs. They want to use one that's interoperable across all of them. So thank you very much for sharing your perspective today. It was very interesting.
Thank you, Rich. Let me go through the chat box, see if I missed anything. Well, there's one from Terry Shane. Quickly, will the blockchain technology used be an open public ledger like IOTA with the data becoming part of a public data commons, or will this be a private blockchain?
That is to be determined. We will be doing an RFP to bring someone on board to do this work on behalf of RUC West. So we will look to them for the advice on how to proceed on that. I don't have any preconceived notions about it. And in part, it's because I'm not a blockchain expert, honestly. I just see this technology as being really transformative and really helpful in what we're trying to do going forward. And so my purpose in being engaged is honestly to be a burden to your saddle and say, we need help. This is what we're trying to achieve. How can we partner to make this work? So we are expecting that we will be doing this procurement probably later this year after we do the connected vehicle ecosystem procurement and get that put to rest. That closes at the end of April. So after that, we'll be looking at developing a statement of work to do the interoperability with blockchain.
Sounds great. So we're at top of the hour. Thank you, Maureen and Scott, for great presentation. We had about 60 people in the audience. Lots of questions, always very helpful. Just for the general information, the video of the presentation will be available in our website. I think it takes a couple of days. But thank you again, Maureen and Scott, for the great presentation. Thanks everybody for joining.
Opportunity. This was really nice of you to do. We're really grateful.
Yes, thank you.